Hello, fellow educators. Welcome to the Classroom Behaviour Solutions podcast, the podcast that gives you weekly scientifically grounded and evidence-based solutions to your behaviour dilemmas, providing a blueprint to developing flexible behaviour solutions that really work for your individual pupils, classes, or even whole school environments. If you're a teacher, a Senko, or even a school leader with a passion for supporting pupil behaviour in a way that is positive and effective, this podcast is for you. My name is Adam Dean, and I'm your host. Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Classroom Behaviour Solutions with me, your host, Adam Dean. This is episode 1, and this week we're just going to really define behaviour and talk a little bit about the function of behaviour. And I know a lot of you are sitting there right now thinking about turning off this podcast because you're all sitting there thinking, well, I know what behaviour is, Adam. I work in a school, I see lots of behaviour. But actually behaviour is a little bit more complex than what people think of specifically as challenging behaviour. That's the most important thing. People usually think of behaviour as challenging behaviour, and it's more complicated than that. So we're going to look at what is behaviour, what affects behaviour, what motivates behaviour, and a couple of quick stories to give some examples. So what is behaviour? Behaviour isn't challenging behaviour or behavioural challenges. Maybe we'll have a discussion about that distinction another time. Behaviour is anything that a living being does, including the things we cannot see. So it includes talking, walking, jumping, nodding, skipping, swearing, and all overt behaviours. So overt behaviours are things that we can see, and things like thinking and feeling, etc., are covert behaviour. They're things that we can't see, we can't measure those things. And a lot of the focus we're going to have on this podcast is going to be around overt behaviours while still recognising that those covert behaviours exist and that they can impact those covert behaviours that we're dealing with. So we can see that when we talk about behaviour, we're not just talking about the challenging behaviours, we're talking about anything that they might be doing. So we could be talking about calling out, swearing, throwing stuff, but we might also be talking about sitting nicely, doing maths works, putting hands up, all of those sorts of things. So those things that you might consider positive behaviour or adaptive behaviours, those are also behaviours. And we might also be talking about children having positive thoughts or positive thoughts associated with high self-esteem or negative thoughts associated with low self-esteem. Now, we can't measure those things, but are they behaviour? Yes, they are. They're just covert behaviour that we can't measure. Now, there is a test to see if something is behaviour or isn't behaviour. I like to call it the dead fish test because it usually has a different name. The dead fish test is simply, could a dead fish do it? If you say something and you say to yourself, could a dead fish do that? And a dead fish could do it, then it's not behaviour. Okay. So, you've got an idea of what behaviour is there. Let's talk about what things influence behaviour. So basically, anything in that living being's environment can and possibly will impact behaviour. So what I like to do is imagine a circle, so a big circle with a big blue dot in the middle doing nothing. Okay? Now, imagine that circle is in a larger circle, and then there are lots of smaller purple spots whizzing around and knocking into the circle in the middle. So the circle in the middle is the being, and all of the other little dots spinning around it is everything in that being's environment, including the things that are internal to that being. So including the emotions that they're having. Those emotions and their own behaviour could impact their behaviour, but the behaviour of other people, basically anything that's happening in that environment could impact behaviour. And that's why behaviour is so much more complex than people quite often think it is. Let's have a little look at an example. And I'll quite often talk about this, I was a pain in the proverbial when I was in secondary school. I was a fairly good student in some ways, but if I didn't get on with a teacher, I was very cheeky. So I'm going to tell you the story of the boy in the German lesson, which is me. And I didn't like going to this particular German lesson. Teacher's behavior was very dismissive of me. She didn't like me. She made that very clear. The work was boring. The lighting was a little bit over bright. It was back in the day, because I'm a little bit old now, when there was a lot of fluorescent lights everywhere. And the behavior of the other students around me was impactful. So if you think about it like this, there I am, I'm sitting in the classroom. The behavior that obviously the teacher wanted to see was me sitting there quietly doing my German work. But her behavior towards me made me less likely to do that. The fact that when I stole the teacher's chair when she wasn't looking and went up and down on the chair, when I did that this other students laughed at me, that influenced my behavior. The fact that I got sent out and avoided doing the work, that influenced my behavior. And the fact that I was tired and bored and that the lighting was poor, those things all influenced my behavior. And of course, also, learning history influences behavior. So last time when I did that, everybody laughed at me in a good way, as far as I was concerned at that point, and I managed to avoid doing the work. So you can see all of those things around me at that point influenced the way I behaved. So to look at another example, you're walking down the street in your nearest city and you see McDonald's. Now, I don't know if you're a big fan of McDonald's or not. I have to admit that especially when I'm hungry, I really like a double cheeseburger and large fries. That's my favorite. So if you're walking down and you see the McDonald's, what sort of factors in your behavioral environment are going to influence your behavior to either go into McDonald's or not go into McDonald's? Well, hunger. If you're hungry and you've not eaten anything for a while, you're more likely to go into McDonald's. If you like McDonald's, again, this is a bit of an internal behavior here, then you're more likely to go in. If you can smell, that smell coming out, for me it's the chips. That smell's going to influence the likelihood of you going in there. There's a great big sign that says McDonald's that you're going to notice. That's going to influence the possibility of you going in there and getting yourself a Big Mac or a double cheeseburger or some chicken McNuggets. But then, let's have a look at it. Is there a massive queue? Maybe you're really hungry, but you're walking along and you see McDonald's. There's a big queue to get into McDonald's. You don't want to stand in a queue. Maybe it's a really, really hot day, and actually you don't want to stand in a queue in the heat. Maybe it's a really cold day, and actually the fact that you're going to be going into a nice, warm McDonald's restaurant and sit down and have a cup of tea and whatever food it is, that's going to influence your behavior. Perhaps you're on a diet, and perhaps you're being really good on that diet, and that is also going to influence your behavior. So you can see how just that bit of behavior of going into McDonald's and ordering is influenced by all these different things in your environment. And that includes the behavior of others. So, okay, let's have a little look in a little bit more detail about what motivates behavior. Do you ever have a time where there's a child in your class who does something and to you it just makes no sense? You've planned this amazing lesson and they're just not engaged with it, or you plan this amazing lesson for this class of pupils and you stayed up all night getting ready for it, and I don't know, when I was in teaching in a mainstream school, I remember building a mummy from scratch and the children were going to dissect this mummy, but loads of kids behave in a way you think ruins that lesson. Or you're working with some children who are studying something that's really important to them because they've got their GCSEs coming up and they're not working hard. And you just think, what is going on? Because that behavior makes no sense to you. Those situations can be A, super confusing, and B, really frustrating. What we have to do there is remember that there is always a reason for that behavior. And sometimes it's linked to complex internal behaviors like emotions and thoughts, and sometimes it's not so complex. So there's always a motivation for behavior, and in later episodes, how we find out what those motivations are, because it's only when we understand what the motivations are around a behaviour that we can come up with a proper intervention. So if the teacher, for example, had an idea of the reasons for the behaviours that I was displaying, she might have been able to come up with a proper intervention that would actually work, rather than just sending me out of the room and reinforcing the behaviour every time. So this week we've talked about what is behaviour. We've discussed how it's basically anything that a living being does. We've talked about how everything in a being's environment, including the being's internal environment, can affect that behaviour. And we've talked briefly about the four main factors or motivators around behaviour and what causes behaviour. So next week, we're going to go into the basics of reinforcement. We're going to talk about it, and we're going to sort of talk about how people can understand them, and also where people sometimes go wrong with them. Yeah, these first few episodes, they're going to be a little bit more theoretical, because a basic grounding in this theory is going to be really useful when we come to start talking about actual interventions. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Classroom Behaviour Solutions podcast. To make sure you don't miss future episodes, click the subscribe button and share this podcast with others. The more people that listen, the more help I can provide. To learn more and to find our social media pages, visit www.classroombehavioursolutions.com. See you next time on the Classroom Behaviour Solutions podcast. Thank you.